The most hated card from every year of Hearthstone. Up first, 2014. Ice Block. 3-mana mage epic secret: when your hero takes fatal damage, prevent it and become immune this turn. This was not only the most frustrating card to play against back in Classic, but is one of the most frustrating cards to play against for the entire mage class even to this day. And it became a problem immediately, with it being included in Freeze Mage, where the objective was to survive, play Alexstrasza to set your opponent's hero to 15, and then finish them off with Frostbolts, Ice Lance, etc. The deck also had cards like Frost Nova and Blizzard with Doomsayer to stall, freeze, and remove the opponent's board. The obvious reason that Ice Block is unfun to play against is that it's a free extra turn that the mage just gets to have, just because. On top of it being annoying in 2015 with the Frost Nova, Doomsayer, Blizzard type packages, they've also had other stalls printed in the mage class over the years, such as Varden, Dawngrasp, and Solid Alibi, and through it all, Ice Block has been at the absolute center of frustration from 2014 until the modern day. But everyone knows by now about Ice Block and the sins it's committed, so let's move on to 2015. Flamewaker. Yes, another mage card. 3-mana 2/4 rare mage minion with the effect: after you cast a spell, deal 2 damage randomly split among all enemies. 2015 is a little bit harder to pick than 2014 though, as another card that was hated was Reno Jackson. Reno Jackson, obviously, if you're playing a Highlander deck, often called a Reno deck, would allow you to fully heal your hero. This is obviously something that is very enjoyable for control players, having a essentially win the game on turn 6 against aggro button, and obviously on the flip side, if you're the aggro player, incredibly frustrating and unfun to play against. But ultimately, I find the RNG aspects of Flamewaker to be more infuriating and as a result more hated than Reno. I also feel like Reno obviously a lot more loved in general, which kind of swings it out of the choice for this year. Going back to Flamewaker, not only is the random aspect of the damage a bad form of RNG that is incredibly frustrating, it's also super fun to be the person that is just randomly machine gunning down the opponent's board. So as a result, lots of people play this deck, and as a result, lots of people have to suffer playing against this deck. If you thought that Freeze Mage was annoying to play against, you definitely didn't want to be put up against Tempo Mage after the Blackrock Mountain Adventure was released. The basic idea of this deck was to establish and maintain board control and momentum from the very start of the game. You would do this by using a lot of cheap spells and minions that interact well with spell spamming, such as Mana Worm and Flamewaker. Flamewaker was a card that just gave so much value. Most of the time, your opponent is going to play him and just spam spells non-stop to clear the board, damage the opponent's face, and maybe even just straight up win the game. And the reason they were able to do this is they combined it with the old Sorcerer's Apprentice. That would make all of your spells cost 1 less. So for 5 mana, you could develop both minions and then just absolutely bombard your opponent non-stop. Despite all the frustration, Flamewaker actually never got nerfed until he rotated out. Next up, 2016. The pick for this one is, I think, very easy, but there are some honorable mentions, whether it be Patches the Pirate, an incredibly powerful card that was incredibly dominant in basically every deck that wasn't like full-on control, and Devolve, a card that was incredibly frustrating because it would remove a key minion that you either needed to die or utilize from the board and from the game entirely. However, I think Barnes takes the cake for this year easily. From One Night in Karazhan, Barnes released as a 4-mana 3/4 legendary minion with the battle cry: summon a 1/1 copy of a random minion in your deck. It looks like an innocent card, until you realize the power it can have by pulling either Death Rattle minions or minions with active effects. One of its biggest first uses was definitely Big Priest, where they would use Barnes to pull out something like a Yasharj, which would just win the game on the spot, since Yasharj could either pull himself or another big minion from your deck. And if your opponent killed it, well, you could just revive it again with its original stats, and then it would do its effect again. Barnes is an incredible outlier in terms of the amount of mana cheating potential, and for a decade now has absolutely dominated various metas. Being nerfed in 2015 from 4 to 5 mana, and today still at 5 mana absolutely being busted in the wild format. This is one of those cards that realistically only gets better as classes have more options to gain mana or to have better minions to cheat out with Barnes, and honestly, quite frankly, could just, at this point, cost like 11 mana, really. Like, let's bump it up a bunch more. Absolutely a hated card. 2017, no stranger to cards that were both powerful and as a result hated. The honorable mention that I have that like realistically could be the pick is Spreading Plague. This card is incredibly frustrating to play against as if you were playing aggro and you had a few minions on board, 3 to 5, your opponent suddenly gains 15 to 30 health via taunts that just absolutely blocks you for several turns and delays the game until they eventually, more than likely, win. And the card became so powerful in the metas it was in that this 5 mana stall more or less was a win the game button, which was incredibly frustrating to play against for anyone playing aggro or mid-range. However, I don't think it's quite as hated as much as the Caverns Below. You see, in 2017, Journey to Un'Goro set introduced us to quests, and one of them in particular stood out as a card that absolutely invalidated many play strategies, which grew resentment from all those players that loved those play strategies, and that of course was the Caverns Below. 1 mana rogue legendary spell quest. Play 4 minions with the same name, which gave the reward Crystal Core, a 5 mana spell that says for the rest of the game your minions are 5 and 5. During the set reviews, this card was very underestimated. Both the requirement and the reward made people think it was going to be not so good, but it was very good actually. The rogue could complete the quest faster than you would think with cards like Shadowstep, Youthful Brewmaster, and Gadgets and Ferryman, and the rest of your deck would just be 1 or 2 cost minions to abuse the effect. Say you had 2 mana 1/3 with Lifesteal Rush, which as its own individual card is really underwhelming, but suddenly had with 5/5 stats is incredibly powerful. And this strategy and card, the Caverns Below, pretty much warped the meta around it, and the moment your opponent played the reward, the game was essentially over, since you had to face a gigantic horde of 5/5 minions for the rest of the game. The quest was eventually nerfed to play 5 minions with the same name instead of 4, but that even wasn't enough, and in the next year they nerfed the reward as well to making it 5/5 down to 4/4. Although both nerfs eventually did get reverted when it rotated to Wild. But during its time in Standard, despite a slightly slow start, it eventually warped the entire meta around it because it entirely pushed out control, and so you either played Caverns Below or you tried to beat it. With aggro, which didn't have very much control to play against because Caverns Below made playing on ladder with control an absolute nightmare. When you have a card like this that creates a deck that is so problematic and so preventative of what you can play, it's no doubt going to become one of the most hated cards in Hearthstone history. Following that, we have 2018, a year that released some pretty prominent cards. One of which we could have chosen but didn't is Shudder Walk. This is one of those cards that I think grew in resentment over the years, but in its time in Standard was fairly limited in what it was able to do, and outside of some extremely egregious shenanigans where the amount of time it would take for Shudder Walk to do its thing was much too long, once that kind of all got adjusted and tweaked, Shudder Walk was still a frustrating card for a lot of people to play against, but not quite as prominent and annoying as a neutral card could be, especially one that just so happened to synergize very well in basically every deck, including the Caverns Below. 2018's most hated card, Giggling Inventor. Giggling Inventor released as a 5 mana 2/1 neutral minion with the battle cry, summon 2 1/1 mechs with Taunt and Divine Shield. It summoned 2 Annoyatrons, for those who know what that card is. On the card set previews from the Boomsday project, it was already hyped, and people knew it would not only be broken, but extremely annoying to play against. When it came out, Giggling Inventor was in around 35% of the decks in the entire meta. And the thing is, this card was used for purposes that were not intended. At the time, Midrange Shaman, Big Spell Mage, and Control Priest used it to slow the game down and get more time, which is what the card would be for. But then you had decks like Zoo Warlock or Pogo Rogue that used this card just because of its immense power level and how impacting it was when it was put on the board. Essentially what I'm saying is you wouldn't just play it as like a neutral solid taunt minion in decks that wanted to slow the game down. You would just play it in everything because that's how overtuned it was. It was so overtuned that people were playing Mossy Horror in their decks unironically, just so that they had an answer to Giggling Inventor when it was played on turn 5. The thought of Mossy Horror seeing play is unfathomable. The card, I mean, look at it. It's a 2/7 that only does something so niche that just doesn't really matter. At 6 mana, you have lots of other ways to kill things. You have board clears, you have much other cards you'd rather be playing. But Giggling Inventor was so popular and so powerful that most decks' best choice to get rid of it was Mossy Horror, which just speaks magnitudes to how strong Giggling Inventor was when it came out. And obviously, if a card's going to be a neutral card, super powerful and super popular, you're going to be playing against it all the time, which is of course going to increase the hatred for it very quickly, which meant obviously Blizzard had to do something about it. So only 2 months after the card was released. Back in October of 2018, they nerfed it from 5 mana to 6 mana. Oh, no, of course not. From 5 mana to 7 mana. A drastic but necessary change. The card was so good that even when it got to the point of rotating to wild and being reverted and being like restored to a stronger power level, they still rebalanced it only to 6 mana. And in March 2026, now 6 years later, they've finally reverted it back all the way down to its original 5 mana. 2019, I think, is the biggest year that surprises me on this entire list. In terms of like cards that were hated during 2019, tons of cards, right? I mean, because cards carry over beyond the year they were released. But in terms of most hated card that released in 2019, there's actually not any to me that are like clear standouts. I don't know if they were just fairly tame with what they released or if they kind of just did a good job of not releasing anything extremely hated. But our options here compared to the other years seem incredibly tame. One such option we have is contactjordanmg, a 6 mana neutral taunt healing minion that would allow any deck that wanted to play it to have a great answer to kind of either stall or beat aggro on turn 6, similar to something like Reno Jackson or Spreading Plague. It obviously wasn't as powerful as those cards, but it was still very helpful, and so as a result, all the decks that wanted such a tool would use it, and so you saw it a lot. But I mean, come on, we have some egregious cards on this list. We can't be picking Contactjordanmg, even if the feelings were fair. It was not the most fun card to play against. Another such option, Bad Luck Albatross, which despite looking very unassuming, was quite annoying when it would fill your deck with useless 1/1 minions, because suddenly, say if you were playing something like Big Priest and you cheated it out of your deck with something, say like a Barnes, you suddenly now have a useless text minion, not only on your board, but also in your res pool. It diluted your draws, it diluted your res pool, it diluted your deck. It was just not very fun to play against because it completely neutered any strategies that kind of cared at all about that or had limited draw. But again, kind of just underwhelming compared to all the other cards we've seen so far. Which kind of leaves us with one final standout, Convincing Infiltrator. Convincing Infiltrator was one of the main faces of Resurrect Priests at the time of Rise of Shadows, a 5 mana 2/6 taunt with Death Rattle, destroy a random enemy minion. The reason that I think this much more hated than something like a Contactjordanmg is because the thing about this deck wasn't just bringing back taunt minions, but it also kept giving them reborn for your opponent to deal with by using cards like Psychop and Mass Resurrect. Anyone that played against this deck still has nightmares from the quotes, "Greetings, fellow human," and "Our home, our tombs." The reason that this card, in my mind, passes any of the others is due to the randomness of its effect. You're not destroying the smallest minion or the biggest minion, and so it's like, okay, like I know what's gonna happen. It's a random minion. It still has a potential to just absolutely destroy your biggest minion and swing the game in your favor, and they just keep bringing it back. So not only do you have to deal with a taunt minion that kills something, but it could kill your biggest thing, and there's not anything you can really do about it if the RNG swings their way. And eventually it just got to a point where people were so sick of Resurrect Priests, so sick of big Death Rattle minions with RNG swings, they had just had enough, and Convincing Infiltrator, despite not being the most powerful card, was just a card that rose to the top of complaints in this year. 2020, man, we have honorable mentions here, but this one's a no-brainer. Cards like Mana Burn and Glide, disruption cards from the new Demon Hunter class. You also could pick cards that were extremely busted or overtuned from the Demon Hunter release. But let's be real here. In 2020, with the Scholomance Academy, Mind Renderer Lucia was printed into the game. And of course, that is the most hated card from 2020. When printed, it was a 2 mana 1/3 legendary priest minion with the battle cry. Swap hands and decks with your opponent until your next turn. I feel like at this point I hardly even need to say how unfun and miserable it was to play against this card, and the decks that abused it. One of the main uses was in aggro decks, surprisingly, because it looks to you like it may be a disruption for combo decks or something. But no, you would just play your entire hand, and then play a Lucia, which would give your opponent an empty hand, and one top deck from your aggro deck to deal with your aggro board. Which would essentially just skip your opponent's next turn. This was a 2 mana Time Warp in an aggro deck. Not only that, but she could be used, like I said, to mess up combos. And then you could use the cards from your opponent's hand that you knew they needed. It was so consistent, and so powerful, and so egregious that it had to be nerfed only 1 month after it came out, going from 2 to 3 mana, which of course, did almost nothing, and it was still extremely broken, and extremely hated, and extremely egregious. So another year later, just another miserable year later, the entire miserable year of 2020, even one could say, they decided to rework the card to Battle Cry. Replace your hand with a copy of your opponent's until end of turn. No longer did it swap hands and decks. Needless to say, this was kind of like the Warsong Commander nerf back in the day, which pretty much killed this card completely and made it see zero play. but by golly was that a breath of fresh air and a relief to everyone, because this card absolutely hated for good reason. In 2021, we have the Forge in the Baron set, which presented us with a very interesting card. A 7-mana epic druid spell that reads, set each player to 0 mana crystals. Set the cost of cards in all hands and decks to 1. This card was absolutely crazy, and once again, miserable to play against. What would happen in the average game is your opponent would play it and their turn on 0 mana. On your turn, you'd have 1 mana. You were able to play 1 card if you happen to have a powerful, impactful card, sweet. But the moment the druid opponent would get his turn back, they would go nuts. The most tame way they would go nuts would just be to re-ramp up their mana with Wild Growth, Overgrowth, or Nourish. And then you have 2 mana and can play 2 cards, and they have like 6 mana and can play 6 cards. That's at the most tame possible place. But druids cheating and ramping more mana than you is old news. What made this card really unfun to play against is that it would mess up your deck, your cards, and your mana. If you were a combo or aggro deck that wanted to play a lot of cards in a single turn, too bad. You're now limited to 1 or 2. You are disrupted pretty heavily, and they are enabled pretty heavily. And in the less tame versions of Celestial Alignment, while you're disrupted, they're able to play their entire deck at once because they've thought through this. They've put cards into their deck that enable them to play their entire deck in 1 turn. Celestial Alignment was nerfed a few months later from 7 to 8 mana, which, much like Mind Render Elusia, did basically nothing. And finally, another miserable year of it later, they changed its effect to only affect the druid that played it, not the opponent as well. This is a year that, unlike 2019, has a lot of things you could pick. For me, the honorable mentions here are pretty obvious. United in Stormwind also came out in 2021, so the entire set of questlines, Pick Your Poison, is a phenomenal honorable mention for this year. Those cards elevated the power level a lot, changed the game a lot, and were present in basically every game, and would be played in every game because of course they start in your hand. Cards like the Demon Seed, Defend the Dwarven District, Raid the Docks were all a pain in the butt to play against, and overall very unfun and very hated. Absolutely reasonable to pick any of them as the most hated card from 2021. Let's move on to 2022, which is a year I don't have an honorable mention for because how could they do this to us? Absolutely egregious and clear pick this year. Theotar, the Mad Duke. Murder at Castle Nathria set gave us a lot of cards that increased the power level, such as Prince Renathal, Sire Denathrius, and more. But Theotar, the Mad Duke, a 4-mana 3/3 neutral legendary minion, had the battle cry, discover a card in each player's hand and swap them, was just turbo busted on another level. We are 2 years removed from Mind Render Elusia, one of the most busted disruption cards of all time, and they go ahead and do it again. This card was extremely insane against combo and control decks that would end the game most of the time instantly when it was played. The difference between this card and other tech cards like Dirty Rat and Mutanus is that it was consistent. Instead of just pulling a random card, you would get to see 3 of them in their hand of like 3 to 7 cards, which meant your odds of hitting it, the cards you needed, was extremely high. And you couldn't just disrupt minions with it either, like Dirty Rat and Mutanus, but also spells, weapons, anything, maybe even a location. So it was insanely easy to steal your opponent's win con and disrupt them majorly for only 4 mana. 3 months after its release, Theotar was nerfed from 4 to 5 mana. But still, that wasn't enough. Another month later, I got nerfed to 6 mana, and they even for some reason threw it a bone and upped its stats to 4/4 to compensate. This, I can assure you, needed no compensation. This card was so powerful that even nowadays, after multiple nerfs, it still sees play in Wild to disrupt combo and control decks. I think this is one of the biggest misconceptions about agency in Hearthstone that has ever existed. People see this card as like a way to have some sort of agency, an answer to a combo deck that your deck wasn't equipped or built to beat. They would say that it was a good card for the game because they were able to remove that non-game some percentage of the time, because instead of just sitting there doing nothing and then dying to the combo deck, they had a way to win the game immediately against the combo deck. But all that does is switch who is winning the non-game. No matter what you played, you just ran Theotar and would invalidate or destroy and immediately win against a lot of things. Extremely busted, extremely hated, and shocking that it was released just 2 years after Mind Render Elusia. 2023 brings us a unique year in Hearthstone with a few different options to consider. One such card, Boom Boss Thogrun, a warrior card that shuffled TNT into your deck that when drawn would destroy a card, or thematically blow it up, in your hand, deck, and board. It would destroy 3 things, 3 cards, just boom. Obviously, you can understand why that would be frustrating to play against when just at the start of your turn, maybe you even have lethal set up, you're all excited to play a card, you're all excited to win the game or do something, have a nice clean answer in your chess match against your opponent. You then draw a TNT, the thing on your board you needed, the thing in your hand you needed, and the thing in your deck you might need blow up. And a TNT can't blow up other TNT, so it's guaranteed to hit something you probably wanted. Another such card that went through a crazy history was Tony, King of Piracy, which, similar to Elusia, would steal and switch with decks from your opponent, which we've discussed why that is frustrating, because you could swap decks, draw their whole deck, blow up their cards, take them for yourself, put them in your own hand, whatever. Very frustrating. We've been over that. But I think a card that was even more frustrating to play against, and was certainly seen in a lot more games due to it being a neutral card, was Reno, Lone Ranger. In an attempt to bring Highlander decks back, Reno Lone Ranger was added in the Showdown in the Badlands expansion, an 8-mana hero card with 5 armor that read Battlecry. If your deck has no duplicates, empty the enemy board and limit it to 1 for a turn. They then throw on the fun text, "It's high noon." Once again, a very, very, very disruptive card. If your opponent's deck relied on playing a lot of minions, you would basically get an extra turn for free, because you're not only getting the tempo of emptying their board, which is like the poof effect from the old Reno Hero Power where death rattles and things don't go off. You then also limited their board to 1 spot, so they could only refill and play 1 card. So you were getting tempo and then mostly getting the turn sent back to you. So if your opponent was an aggro deck, that 1 slot they were playing probably not that impactful. And if they wanted to play like a Colossal minion, they couldn't, because the arms, the appendages, wouldn't summon. You only have 1 spot. If you wanted to play a location and a minion, right, etc., can't do it. And because in the new world of Highlander cards, your deck didn't have to start with no duplicates, it just had to have no duplicates when you played Reno. Even decks that didn't start as Highlander decks would play this card because they knew in the modern day they had good enough draw to get to a point where you had no duplicates and you could play this card. Which meant Reno was good in just about everything and good against just about everything. It was extremely versatile, extremely powerful, especially against aggro. A few months after his release, they nerfed him to 9 mana, which, much like all the other nerfs in this video, didn't do very much. It's just like an attempt. They're like throwing the players a bone, like, hey, oh, maybe this will be fine, right? But then it's not. So 2 months later, they nerf it again to 10 mana. And in this case, Reno Lone Ranger was so powerful and so hated that even at 10 mana, it was too good, too strong, and too frustrating, and players were sick of seeing his neutral colored face that would replace every hero and make every game feel the same. They were sick of it. So they decided to finally nerf it more than just mana, and they decided to remove the part that would limit your opponent's board to 1 space for a turn. So you finally could redevelop and play as normal after your opponent wiped your entire board, with no death rattles or anything, even locations, everything being gone. And even then, Reno was still good. But at least a lot of the frustration and ridiculousness was put to rest. 2024, man, it'll be getting spicy. A lot of options again. Tough year to pick. Maybe you pick Ceaseless Expanse, because it's an extremely high statted minion that you could actually play pretty consistently and have an entire big board clear that would wipe everything and swing the board back in your favor for essentially no mana. Huge, powerful swing that was very game and meta defining and had to be nerfed twice. You could also pick a deck, an archetype, Wheel of Death, that allowed you to clear your deck but set up a clock that your opponent had to kill you by, or you would win instead. Both very frustrating to play against. One in the sense that Ceaseless is just an inevitability. Every deck's going to play it. You're going to have to deal with it at some point, and it makes it kind of hard to know when to play stuff and how to play, and you kind of feel like you have to not go all in and kind of play slower than you'd want to, so Ceaseless is kind of impacting the game before it's even playable. And then you have Wheel of Death, which is like you're just sitting there staring at this timer, kind of feeling helpless. And a lot of times you probably lost the turn they played it, but you don't know that. You keep trying, and you just feel more dread as that turn moves up and ticks up. But I think a card even more hated, a card nerfed very quickly because of how hated it was, because of how strong it was, because of how silly it was, because of how much of an outlier it was in terms of like what Hearthstone is supposed to be in the great dark beyond. Quasar, a 6-mana epic rogue spell that reads shuffle your hand into your deck, reduce the cost of cards in your deck by 3. The purpose of this card was to have this big effect with the big drawback of not having a hand anymore. But that drawback was not as impactful as Blizzard thought. Rogue had cards like Knick-Knack Shack, a location that would allow you to draw from the board without having any cards in your hand. Or a weapon like Quick Pick that could allow you to, again, draw just by attacking with your hero. And you could have that equipped before playing your Quasar. These two cards and cards like it would allow you to redraw your cards quickly. And after that, well, you would just play your entire deck in a single turn, since everything was discounted by 3 and you of course built your deck around that. And you also have preparation, which made it easier for you to cheat out your Quasar in the first place. So you're doing all of this as soon as turn 3 or 4, and then winning the game as soon as turn 4 or 5. Whether it's consistent or not, it's not fun to queue up a game and then just go, oh, they hit the stuff, I lose on turn 4 or 5. This was a modern turbo to the nuts version of the classic Miracle Rogue deck, where they would just draw everything and then blow you up, but they would do it earlier and everything was free and there was nothing you could really do about it, and you just had to sit there and watch them play all their cards, vomit it all out, and lose. Obviously, that type of deck, that type of card, unfun and very, very hated. As a result, it was nerfed only 1 month after its release, going from 6 to 7, no, not 6 to 7, 6 to 8, and it was still pretty solid. But at least the absurdity of it happening as consistently as it was and as early as it was removed, which could allow the hate from it to kind of dissipate a little bit, maybe shift to something else. 2025 brought us one of the most flexible powerhouses in Elise, the Navigator, a legendary minion from the lost city of Ungoro. 4 mana, 3 attack, 5 health, Battlecry. If your deck started with 10 cards of a different cost, craft a custom location. This custom location is very similar to Kazaka's from back in the day, because much like that custom spell, for this custom location, you choose between a 1, 5, and 10 mana cost option, and are then presented with 2 different effects that are combined into one location. And those effects obviously scale based on the mana cost of the location that you're making. Much like with Kazakus as well, there's usually specific options you're hoping to hit, and some choices that are generally strongest. But a large part of why Elise is so hated is because of how overpowered players feel she is, regardless of which options you end up choosing. Whether it be a board of rush tokens to clear or flood the board, a death rattle damage AoE to all enemies, a practically free spell, or a copy of a minion, all the options were powerful, and you got 2 of them. With all that said, a particular neutral minion from an expansion dominating its expansion cycle is nothing new in Hearthstone. We've seen this with Ziliax twice, among other options such as Sire Denathrius. It's also not nothing new for said card to get nerfed just in time for the next expansion cycle. Elise haters can be happy. As of March 2026, in preparation for a new standard year and the Cataclysm expansion, Elise would be pretty substantially nerfed. Blizzard reduced the amount of damage dealt at every mana cost for that entire option, the amount of Raptors summoned at the 5 and 10 mana cost option, and also reduced the stats of the copied minion at the 5 and 10 mana cost option, with the 1 mana summon a copy of a minion cost option being entirely removed. That has been the most hated card from every year of Hearthstone. Thanks for watching, and if you made it this far, please do subscribe so that you don't miss future videos.